Morning, everyone. Welcome
G'day.
back to Theology Thursday. I think we're near the end, Dave.
Yeah.
Well, not the end of Theology Thursday, but as you know, we've been going through the fundamental doctrines as outlined in the Statement of Faith on our website, at least. But it's pretty much the same as every church.
So today we come to the last couple on the list, but they're two that roll into one, really.
Right.
And these deal with the return of Christ and the judgment of the unsaved. They're the two things that are mentioned. So we roll that into one.
Yes, great.
So we did actually a whole series on the return of Christ. So I don't want to rehash all of that. But neither can we just ignore this altogether. No. So we're going just for one session, just to have a big picture, a broad brush of this.
Yeah, so topic. We did 6 sessions on this not too long ago. No. To be honest, I can't remember how long ago it was, but scroll back through the YouTube channel and have a look at that in detail. But just today, so give us just a brief outline of it, Dave.
Yeah. Okay, so the return or the second coming or the second advent of Christ, also known as the parousia, meaning the presence or appearance or arrival even. And that refers to the future return of Christ to this earth at the end of the present age. And the Bible makes it clear that this return will be visible and physical as he comes from heaven to bring final judgment and usher in the eternal state.
I think occasionally, just occasionally, there's a couple of Christians out there, that it's not very common, that would say, oh, he'll return spiritually. Yeah. But no, the Bible's very clear that it is physical.
There's one whole Christian group that says that.
So, they're rare though. You probably have never met one. Most denominations, almost all theologians, like 99% would say, no, it's physical. He is returning.
Visible, physical, final.
Coming back into our
I would add to
dimension.
That, and I think you would as well, imminent. And that is, it could happen at any time. We're living in that stage. The hope that we have as Christians of his return and the salvation of our mortal bodies from sin once and for all, that is, even from the very presence of sin, and where our mortal and corruptible bodies become immortal and incorruptible, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15. That has given great hope to believers since Christ ascended into heaven.
Actually, just a thought. If you've been following the Sunday messages from New Life Church Nambour, 1 Corinthians 15 is coming up. I'm in 1 Corinthians 13 at the moment. And I'm still
after Christmas.
It's going to have to be after Christmas. Next year, keep your eye on it, because when we get to 1 Corinthians 15, I might even ask Dave to do one on that one. But that deals with, again, what happens when Christ returns and what happens to our physical bodies, these things that are susceptible to pain and breakdown and all sorts of disease and things. What happens to these? That's pretty detailed. So have a read of it before we get there, but stay tuned. Back to you, Dave.
So this hope has helped so many over the years as they've faced enormous persecution and great tribulation as they stood for their faith, the faith that Christ had entrusted to them.
In fact, I've heard it said, when I was at Bible college, that the people who understand the book of Revelation the clearest are the persecuted church.
Yes.
Because John was persecuted when he was writing it, and the church worldwide at that point, throughout the Roman Empire, was being persecuted, fiercely. So this is written under those circumstances. So the persecuted church do have a unique understanding of the book of Revelation and end times and things. So, I think it's.
I think the New Testament's unambiguous. It establishes the doctrine of the second coming. It was not only mentioned by Jesus himself, but it's expounded in the writings of Peter, James, and John, and Paul. And,
they all mention. They all do allude to it.
This second coming or second advent, the words don't actually appear in the New Testament. Second coming, but probably Justin Martyr around the 2nd century developed this concept of the second coming.
Right, because the first coming was Christmas time, right? And so, in fact, that month leading up to Christmas is called Advent. That's the first Advent, and now we're talking about the second Advent when he returns.
So the event itself is certainly mentioned many times. with one of the most common nouns used in the New Testament being parousia, the one that we mentioned before, and Peter and Matthew and James and Paul all use that term. And that term is generally used to speak of people coming to be present, as opposed to being absent. And it becomes the technical term in the early church to talk about the future coming of Christ at the end of the age.
Sometimes though too, when like if a king was coming or somebody was coming to visit, it was called
the parousia.
The parousia. Yeah.
And that was used commonly from around about the 2nd century. So it all fits in with the same time frame. The association of the parousia with the arrival of the king, as you've mentioned, that was the common term. And so for the coming of the King of Kings, it was pretty natural to use that term.
Yeah, the ultimate parousia.
It just matches, doesn't it?
Bring it on.
So the other word that's used a lot is apocalypsis. Now, sometimes we hear the apocalypse, and that just means revelation. So the book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ, not the revelation of John, as some people
I think it's a very misunderstood word.
Yes.
Movies like Apocalypse Now or the apocalypse. It feels like the great war, the great but actually, as Dave said, it just means revelation.
So both terms emphasise the visible nature of his return. So whether we're talking about apocalypse or parousia, it's the visible nature of his return as opposed to something that is hidden from view or that's done in secret or even merely that spiritual presence, as we said. So we believe that the return of Christ is a literal and physical event, not just something that happens in the spiritual realm. We can't say that he came in 1870 or whatever it was that some people say. So that just doesn't fit. As Jesus was preparing his disciples for his ascension back to heaven, back to the Father, he comforted them with the promise that if I go away, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you may also be. It's interesting that in the past that we've talked about before, each cup has a meaning and a promise.
Right. In the Passover.
In the Passover, those 4 cups. And we know that the 3rd cup was the cup of redemption. But after that, Jesus said, I'll not take drink the fruit of the vine again until I drink it new with you in the Father's kingdom. And that's the 4th cup, which is the cup of benediction, and the promise of God that goes with that 4th cup is, I will take you to myself. So even in that little thing, Jesus was referring to the return of Christ.
Hold on, everyone, I'm coming back.
Yes. So when he ascended, the angel said to the disciples, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up into heaven? This same Jesus who has been taken from you, so the physical Jesus who's been taken from you into heaven, will come again in the same way that you've seen him go into heaven. So he's going to come again physically, just as he left physically.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of people have interpreted that as not just in the same way, but in the same place. That he will return to the Mount of Olives, right next to the city of Jerusalem, and enter Jerusalem through the eastern gate. So there's quite some people make it a big deal of that, which is fine. I don't really have a problem with that. It's possible, and in fact probably probable. But yeah, that he would return to the same spot.
So the return of Christ, we believe, is also imminent, meaning it's near. And when it comes, it will come quickly. Early Christians anticipated that Christ would return in their lifetime and admonished believers to watch and be ready. And according to the New Testament, the last part of the present age began with the first coming of Christ. So now we live in the last days or the last hours, as John wrote in 1 John 2:18. And that's a really interesting verse.
Hit us with it.
Well, John covers 2 big issues for the 21st century church. Look briefly at what he said. Children, it is the last hour, and just as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, so many Antichrists have appeared. That's how we know it's the last hour. So first of all, he answers the question, are we living in the last days? And John says, yep.
Yeah.
But here's 100%. The catch. John was living in the last days as well.
The last days are 2,000 years.
Yeah, that's right.
And counting.
The last days are not just at the end of the 21st century.
Right.
They cover the whole era of the church. If I can use it like this, from Pentecost to Perusia.
He even mentions last hours there.
Yeah.
So some might say, well, if we're in the last days, 2,000 years, the last hours, that's our lifetime, right?
But John's already grabbed it.
It's all that 2,000 year period. I wonder if the early Christians in those first couple of 100 years had thought he won't be back for 2,000 years, would they have slacked off? I wonder if the church would have gotten up and running anyway, because they were expecting Christ to return imminently, as you said, as we are, and that is a motivator. That motivates evangelism. That is, oh my goodness, he's coming back. Our friends need to meet him. They need to know him. They need to have their sins forgiven. They need to be forgiven. We got to get on with this. Whereas maybe if they were thinking, oh, don't worry about it, it's 2,000 years away, maybe they
might have grown.
Who knows, right?
Yeah. The other interesting thing about what John wrote in that verse is the reason that we know that these are the last days. John said, well, we know that Antichrist is coming in the last days, and many Antichrists have appeared already. This was John saying back then. So John was saying that the Antichrist that people talk about today was not an individual who would come at the end. Rather, it's a reference to the many false Christs who have appeared through the church era. And again, we need to note that the Greek word antichristos means not opposed to Christ, but substituted for Christ.
And I think it's also, as you would have noted from what Dave quoted there, the Bible doesn't actually say the Antichrist. There's no pronoun the. It's not there. It just says Antichrist spirit. So, but because some people have started calling it the Antichrist, we're led to believe that there's this one man and he's going to be a super evil, Dr. Evil and run the whole world.
There's been plenty of them.
Well, Hitler and you name them, Stalin, Mao Zedong, name them. But of course that's not what the Bible's saying. It's a spirit of Antichrist, of substituting the Redeemer, substituting our Savior, substituting Jesus for something else.
So this eon or age, call it the church age, which is what generally gets all the last days, whatever. It began with Christ's first coming, and it will end at his second coming, and a new eon, a new age will start with his second coming. And this age begins with the day of the Lord, that is the time in which Christ appears, raises the dead, executes judgment, and renews the world. So the return of Christ gives hope to Christians when they're going through difficult times. Peter wrote that when we go through trials, we can rejoice because Jesus Christ will be revealed when he comes again. For in the age that is ushered in by this second coming, we will live forever in the presence of God, and all sin and sickness and sorrow will all be gone. So Christians have this great hope that even when going through the darkest of times, their future reward will make their current problems insignificant. So Paul said to the Roman church in Romans 18, Romans 8, verse 18, I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us.
Just hold on, it'll be worth it.
And that's quite a statement to make when you understand that Paul was writing to a church that faced great tribulation in which Christians were fed to lions and burnt on stakes and had all other horrible things happen to them. And of course this tribulation has continued through the centuries. Christians have been persecuted at virtually every point of church history, ever since the stoning of Stephen.
Right. And I know, so if you go back, as we said, in our YouTube channel to when we did a whole series on this, there's a lot we mention on that, because I think Western Christians sometimes think, well, before the return of Christ, there'll be a great tribulation. But just before 3 years before Jesus comes back, it's going to get really hard for Christians. And we would say it's already really hard for Christians. Maybe not in your neck of the woods, but if you were to go to
the persecuted church, Korea, Muslim countries,
North Korea, for sure, or in Northern Africa and parts of the Middle East, the Christian church in China is persecuted mercilessly. And it's more now. Apparently there are more people that have been martyred in the last century than in all 19 centuries preceding it combined. Yeah. So it is terrible at the moment. But it always has been. There always has been persecution against against Christians, because of this Antichrist spirit, the substitute spirit, the one that says, don't go with Jesus, follow this instead. Maybe it's mammon, maybe it's idolatry, maybe it's whatever it is. I mean, it is false religion. Whatever it is, it's substituting for Christ, and therefore it persecutes Christ.
Yep. So Peter says that knowing that Christ will return, every Christian should live in expectancy, and they should live lives that are godly and holy. So the return of Christ should not only be a hope that keeps us in time of trouble, but a reality that should motivate us to live in the way that God expects us to live.
Right.
So in godliness and holiness and fulfilling the commission.
I was listening to a great message on the power of the gospel that Bill Johnson was preaching just recently. And he said, it's interesting that many Christians have more faith in the second coming than they do in the power of the gospel. Yeah. They have more faith. In other words, they're hoping and waiting for Jesus to return and fix it all, rather than him coming back to a planet that we have fixed in his name. That there is power in the name of the gospel, and he's commissioned us to go and fix it. Yeah. You've got the power, you've got all of this, the Spirit of God in you. You're my ambassadors. Go fix it. But people are going, can't we just wait for Jesus and let him fix it? The answer is no. We've been commissioned.
Yeah, we've got a job to do.
Yeah.
Throughout church history, theologians have largely agreed on the general details regarding the return of Christ. But late in the 19th century or early 20th century, an Irish priest named John Nelson Darby introduced significant debate and a renewed focus on some aspects of eschatology with his view on this thing called dispensationalism.
Right.
And we did deal a lot with that.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that, back in the day.
That debate was focused mainly on a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ and the concept of a single Antichrist and a period of great tribulation immediately prior to Christ's return. So we did that whole series, and just go back on our YouTube channel and you'll find that series there.
Yeah.
So the return of Christ is final. It's unalterable. No matter what you think about the return of Christ, you're not going to change anything.
Nope. It's going to happen.
When he came the first time as a babe in a manger and lived gently and humbly. But when he comes again, he'll come as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And every knee on earth and in heaven and under the earth will bend to his absolute sovereignty, his majesty. And every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And he will come as a true judge, and he will reward his saints and judge the wicked. So his first coming, Jesus accomplished the work of redemption, and when he comes again, he will bring about the consummation of all things in final judgment. So in effect, completing the redemption. So for believers, it's a day of salvation and redemption. It's our glorious hope. But for the unbeliever, it's a day of wrath and judgment.
That's right. Well, 1 Corinthians says we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and be, and get what we've done, whether it's good or bad. Judgment is, you're forgiven. Welcome to welcome to eternity, welcome to heaven. And if you're not forgiven, then you have to
you face the judgment. And we don't fully understand the nature of eternal judgment, but it will be eternal, it will be inescapable, and it will be devoid of every good thing, because every good and perfect thing comes from God. And so outside of his presence there cannot be any good or perfect thing. So there's darkness and loneliness and hunger and pain and all of those sort of things.
And it's hot. It says, like in Jude, that it's hot. So the Bible doesn't go into great detail about either heaven or hell, to be honest.
Those
but it's not
flames
good.
may not be physical.
Hell is,
Those flames, they may be the burning within us. As a person in that situation looks into the light,
right,
and sees what heaven is, and they could have been there, and instead they're stuck here.
No, I think because we are physical beings and we have only ever known the physical, often we translate or interpret all of these things that Jesus mentioned and the Bible speaks about as physical. But like, for example, when Christ returns, he evidently ascended. So he started actually rising, apparently, in front of the disciples and then disappeared. So that's, raised some questions. The Russian cosmonauts, they thought, well, he's in heaven. Let's go up to the moon. Let's see if he's up there. And of course, that's not where he went. He's in a spiritual dimension. So in the same way that right now there are angels about, and there are potentially demons about as well, around us, they're in a different dimension, and God is in that dimension. So when Christ returns, he is merely coming from that dimension into the physical dimension again. So he's not flying in from the moon, Saturn, Jupiter, or anywhere else. He's coming from the spiritual dimension into the physical dimension, where everyone will see.
And that return, the return of Christ, will bring about the consummation of all things. There will be a new heaven and a new earth, and Christ will forever reign with his people. And as Paul wrote, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are, and notice that Paul says we who are alive. So he's expecting it then. So we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And that's a big expression that we dealt with, and we haven't got time to do it now. But to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we will ever be with the Lord. So Christ will return to fulfill prophecy and the promises that he made. He'll return to save mankind from total destruction, to resurrect and transform believers into immortal and incorruptible beings, and to reign as king eternally. We know that's going to happen.
But when's it going to happen, Dave?
Well, as somebody said, I can tell you the exact time. Yeah, at the time you least expect it.
There you go. Yes, he is. I do think he will return soon. I think there's enough evidence to satisfy me, at least.
Yeah, I'm the same, but my dad was the same.
Yes, I know. My grandfather was too. So it could be any moment, or he could wait a long time.
I can't imagine it's going on a long time, but who knows?
Yeah, and the point is, that you said earlier, and we made mention of that we are to expect him imminently, and that should motivate us to live according to his word, his ways, and to fulfill the mission he's given us. There's no time to dilly-dally. So upward and onward. God bless you. And I think that brings us to the end of our series on the fundamental doctrines as expressed in that.
We'll do a couple of Christmassy things over the next couple of weeks, and then take a break over.
And we'll take a break over Christmas and be back next year. So God bless you, and I do hope you have a wonderful Christmas, and we'll see you next Theology Thursday as we bring that one up, Christmas, the first Advent.
Yeah.
Okay, ciao.
Bless you.